she's still in hypnotic state with open eyes.
Yeah.
Well, as everybody knows, you don't have to close your eyes to go into a trance state. We do that clinically because it cuts down the visual distraction and makes it easier for people, but most of the time when we go into the trance state naturally, we do not have our eyes closed anyway. That includes children. For instance, if you're driving a car down a highway and you're going down a familiar road where you've been before and you suddenly feel yourself in a state of relaxation, you'll often go into a trance state. Of course, your eyes should be open. That's perfectly safe because you're relaxed and you're alert, whereas in physiological sleep you're not relaxed but you're not alert. So that's not contraindicated. A lot of times you have to have people open their eyes for different reasons while they're in the trance state. Recently I was dealing with a child who was, we were using hypnosis to stop bedwetting. You know, Sigmund Freud identified anuresis as one of the chief reasons to use hypnosis 150 years ago, and it remains one of the primary treatments for bedwetting. I had two children in my office at the same time, both from the same family, where bedwetting was a familial sort of pattern and had been in a few generations before. Within 4 sessions, they had stopped bedwetting simply because they had more alertness to the full bladder and some of the things that you suggest during that state. I think this little girl demonstrated for us pretty well some of the things that we try to do during the state of hypnosis. Eyelid closure then is not necessary. You can have people that feel too dissociative as you did. Sometimes people worry about dissociation. Again, I had a child who was worried that her hands were not attached, and I had her open her eyes, look at her hands, and then go on with the trance. You can do things like that when you need to.
I think, though, that when you see with a child, obviously with all the distractions here and all these people looking at her, smiling at her, it gets a little difficult. But really, the intoning and going on, you may have to go a little longer. At the end, you can see that she really was. Her father said felt her body was more relaxed against him, and you could feel the difference. Sometimes you also might have the parent rock them while you're talking. So if the child feels okay about it, you can pat them. A lot of times with smaller children, we don't hold them ourselves if the parents are present because that's a settle for a bad time. If it's a hospitalized child and the parents aren't available, then a lot of times holding the child is a good way to establish sort of an instant rapport and communication. It's just you sort of have to vary it with the situation in which you find yourself. The other thing I think that you need to keep in mind is that children often don't go into a state nice and calm, sitting there with their eyes closed. As he said, they may open their eyes. If they're pre-verbal, obviously, they may go into it with their eyes open in any case. But a lot of times you'll see movements. They may be repetitive, they may be rhythmical movements. You see kids kind of flap their arms, and you see them shake their feet. And those things are things you don't need to be discouraged about. It doesn't mean that they're not getting into it. It's just that that's the way they do it. We all, even as we get older, if you have a preconceived notion about how you're supposed to go into an altered state, people often do. Why don't you tell them what the guy wanted to do?
Yeah, I was consulting at a mental health center north of Denver, and we had a man who believed that he had, his wife, his ex-wife, had, thanks a lot, had put a hex on him. And there are some socioeconomic groups in Colorado that believe that hex is very powerful. And so this man was impotent because his wife had put a hex on him when he ran off with his girlfriend, and he couldn't perform with his girlfriend. But in this case, usually we don't encourage the belief that hypnosis is magic, but in this case we thought we'd parlay that and let him, we didn't say it wasn't or that it was, but we had another magic equally potent that could help him to restore himself. So went through the session, and in the session suggested to him that his potency would return, which it did, and he was contented with his new lady. strange thing though. When he went into the trance state without any bidding from me, he lay there on the table in a very rigid manner. He was on the examining table in a clinical setting in a mental health center. And he made himself very stiff and rigid. I guess this is maybe the way you become potent again, is to look stiff and rigid. I don't know. Anyway, that's what he did. And I told him at the time, and we repeated 2 or 3 times to ensure that he maintained his gains, and I told him he didn't need to be quite so stiff and rigid, and that he could occupy a more relaxed posture on the table, but he persisted in doing that. The upshot of this is about 3 or 4 years later, they wanted me to come to this outlying town and demonstrate hypnosis, and I thought about this guy had done so well, so I asked him if he'd be willing to come and demonstrate, and lo and behold, when he went into the trance state, he was as rigid as an iron bar lying on the table. 2 years later, my admonition that he need not assume that posture, but I think it was sort of symbolic.
Only if you're mad.
Yeah.
I think that it is important though to keep in mind that with kids you do have to not be discouraged when it doesn't all go perfectly, and that you really do need to persist and hang in there. Once you work with people that are maybe, say 4 to 7 years old, they like to play a lot of games, and so we usually use games. He's going to demonstrate that in a minute. The older they get, of course, the more you can just explain what's happening, and by the time you get to a pre-adolescent, they're very much wanting to be treated like adults, and so explaining all the scientific things is a good way to go with them. But with younger children, you really just need to kind of find a technique that works for you and that you feel comfortable with, and then be willing to hang in and persist, even if the child doesn't seem to be gaining as much as you'd like from it. You want to, we left our dolly back in Colorado, so Christina very nicely made us a hat and for our doll. It's a rather sickly looking doll, but a doll nonetheless.
This is my friend. We use toys a lot with kids because it's familiar and they think that it's a game. Again, we had to improvise a lot of techniques to work with different ages with severely burned children that I was just describing to you, and one of them was a game we call Doctor Says. There's a game we play in America.
Is the name of the game?
Doctor Says. It's a takeoff on Simon Says. Simon Says is a game, and the way it's played is that the people playing it, if they say Simon Says, then the subsequent action is done. For instance, I would say to Janine, Simon says, thumb your nose. She would do it. If I say, pick up the chair, she would not. In other words, you only obey when Simon says. And so you can adapt that game to hypnosis by having Doctor Says. And you run the kids through a couple of requests. You say, Doctor Says, lick your lips. And then you say, raise your right arm. And of course, they cleverly know better than that, so they don't raise the right arm. You run them through 2 or 3 things like that. And then pretty soon you can say something like, Doctor says, close your eyes. Doctor says to listen very carefully to what doctor has to say. Doctor says da-da-da-da-da-da. And so it's an easy way to introduce them in a way that's familiar to them and a game. Sometimes we use mannequins. I had a little crow who was very clever, and he was used with the adolescents because the crow, he participated with us on my hand, but he would try to outsmart the adolescents would outsmart them. I had a teddy bear who was a real bumbler, and he was always making mistakes, and the children could do much better than he, so whenever they could do better than the teddy bear, they felt very good about that. And the teddy bear was a real dummy because he kept making mistakes right and left, and the kids were always able to do better than he, and then once we got again into the routine, we could say, Doctor says, close your eyes, etc. So a mannequin, any kind of a plaything you can devise or use to assist them will help in those instances quite well. We get into the same kind of generic delivery that you've heard from both of us today. Sometimes you can enlarge it, maybe you folks do this, to use idyllic imagery and progressive relaxation in your extraction ceremony. Of course, it doesn't matter, they can say the same thing again and again. But after an hour and a half, I suppose that would become monotonous. So if you have the model, as I said, then you can move up from the ankles to the knees to the thighs, etc.
I was just gonna say, also with children, if you have several children, 2 or 3 anyway, too many gets too many, but if you have a few children, there's a natural contagion that goes with the altered state, and if one of them picks it up, the other ones sort of follow. There's also kind of a competition or game playing that children seem to get into naturally, and they want to do better than the person next to them. And so if you have at least a couple of 2 or 3 children at a time, that's often better. And sometimes, for example, on the cancer units or in the burn units, if we don't have more children, we'll get one of the staff members to sit in and do it with the child. That way, it also takes away some of the strangeness. They've got some company in the process, and they seem to do better. It's just another way to work with children.
In your countries, I don't know how common it is for others than, in our country, a lot of times only doctors do hypnosis. Although we train nurses and we train physical therapists, we train anyone we can, because doctors cannot do all of the necessary hypnosis. One of the things you can do if you train a child to do something like up on a ward, you train a severely burned kid to use hypnosis, then they can get downstairs to physical therapy, and in the whirlpool they can use the same commands. The PTs can intone the same words that were said up there, and they can continue or induce the state in the child down there. So then you get kids who are in excruciating pain, but they're able to tease off their own burn dressings, for instance, things of this nature. And using it with kids with cancer, you can really do pretty remarkable things. We did a 2-year study at Children's Hospital in Denver, in which we taught all of the children in the burn or on the oncology unit. They had various kinds of cancer to use hypnosis, and another nurse, not Janine, who was trained at the university by one of our leading hypnotherapists in Colorado, and I had this group for 2 years, and we had all the little kids come down and sit in a big room in the basement of the hospital. There must have been about 20, and one of them was too ill to come down, and so the nurse taught him to use hypnosis in his unit up on his unit, right in his bed. One night when I was making rounds at the hospital, he said, "Dr. LeBlanc, I'm going to use my relax for a bone marrow tomorrow," meaning that he was going to have a needle stuck through his skin, through his sternum, and into his bone marrow, using only hypnosis. I was a little taken aback, but I encouraged him. I said that would be fine, and sure enough, without any anesthesia, the next day he had that procedure performed, and he was holding court, you might call it, the next day, because he'd done the most remarkable thing in the hospital for a while, and he got the credit, and he deserved the credit for doing a pretty unusual thing. That's an exquisitely painful procedure. The periosteum of the bone is worse than the skin, and he did it without anesthesia. Give you an idea of how much confidence and how much analgesia he achieved by himself. He did a self-induced trance and had this procedure done. So you can achieve, even in little guys, pretty remarkable results, and very useful ones, especially when they have potential allergies and that kind of problem.
That's unusual. He never runs out of things to say. Lost your train, you want to
See,
help us?
I always say that. I'm trying to think of enlarging on the children's thing.
The other thing that we were asked about again was working with other specialized populations, and again the issue of tapes. This came up during the break. As we talked about, we tend not to use tapes except with certain special populations, and those are people, again, who have some inability to get into the state on their own. People perhaps who are delirious, who are very mentally impaired, maybe some small children who just need something to listen to while the surrogate grandmas rock them. In those cases, we will make a tape. Usually, again, they're used within an institutional setting, and they play routinely just because people like them too much and they're too easy to use, and then they can't get into the state without the tape. And that's the problem with it. I mean, if you could always have a tape player with you and you knew that the tape would never break and the tape player would never lose its batteries, there'd probably be nothing wrong with listening to a tape. But since I don't know any machines that fit that criteria, it's not the best way to do it. We sometimes tell people that what they're going to do actually is make a tape for themselves in their head. If they're real determined to have a tape, we just tell them, well, that's what we're doing for you. We're making it for you, but it's going to be in your head, so it'll always be available to you.
Some people that have something like an organic brain syndrome where they just plain can't remember because of their their immediate recall is not good. They can't remember what's been said, then we'll use a tape for them. Let them use it every time they use hypnosis. Or if someone comes from afar, then we'll make them take. If they come from someplace in our country, we'd prefer to have them call us long distance and use the hypnosis over the telephone as opposed to cutting in the tape. Someone comes from, we've had a few people come from Europe at times, then of course it's difficult, not so bad as it used to be, but it's still a little more mature. Then we might cut them a tape to take home with them. I don't know whether many of you have used much telephone trance, but it turns out to be an excellent way to deal with certain impaired populations. Some of them, for instance, cannot come to the hospital as readily because, I'm thinking now about hemophiliacs and other severely injured groups. But you can, rather than have them miss a session with the group, it's better to have the session in the hospital, call on the telephone, include that person by telephone in his home. We've capitalized on that once. Hemophilia as a group of kids I'll talk to you about here, maybe today, but maybe today because you wanted to hear before you left tomorrow. I'm thinking about one time when we needed money to treat them. It costs $30,000-$40,000 every time they go to the hospital, and it's a lot of money to raise on a voluntary basis. And so we thought of a gimmick, namely that 3 of our hemophiliacs were in New York City. They're across the country from Denver, and we had the regular scheduled group for the hemophiliac kids in Denver, grouped them together, got the media around, and included the 3 kids in New York by telephone. And the media, being sort of ignorant of this easily performed miracle, thought that was great, that was big stuff, and so they played it up in the newspapers, and we were able to capitalize that in our next fund drive and got a little more attention to hemophilia than we might otherwise. But people that are used to trance especially don't have to be looking you in the eye when you do trance. You can fortify their skill in whatever setting they're in if they can hear you on the telephone. It's better to do that than to skip a session, especially if you're in the training end of it. So don't overlook that possibility as another means.
The other thing in terms of specialized populations would be people who are more brain damaged perhaps, who really do have a hard time getting into it. And some people really can't for whatever reason. They may be able to, over time, listening to tapes, but every once in a while you do see somebody who just doesn't seem to be able to get into the state. I think it's pretty rare, and I think it's mostly related to motivation. But I've come across a few, and they all had pretty severe cerebral cortical atrophy. And so it may have been some interference in concentration. It's difficult to know since we don't know exactly how. And again, they are people who perhaps with enough time and with the tape to play every day might be able to be reached. Other times, people who are, of course, comatose, you don't know if you reach them or not. There may be other people, as he talked about, who are delirious, who have been reached, but again, you really have to persist with those folks.
I've recently been, sir?
I hope my question doesn't sound quite bizarre. Have you ever heard of anybody working with global amnestic patients with hypnosis? Patients who don't remember anything more than for 3 minutes. What happens after they've been in a trance for more than 3 minutes? Do they stay in trance? Do they remember that they're in trance? If they don't remember things for more than 3 minutes, has anybody ever